All right, we'll get rolling. We got fun stuff to cover today of some of the historic evidence for Jesus. And then Dave Long is going to play our skeptic today and draw on, draw on 20 years of conversations with people that struggled with these ideas. So I think everybody gets, we do have these four gospel narrative accounts. A lot of times in secular culture that's been attacked and discounted, but it's pretty clear that these were eyewitness accounts, or in the case of Luke at least, drawn from eyewitnesses. Even guys like Bart Ehrlman will say there's more evidence for Jesus being a historical figure in first century Palestine than any other contemporary Palestinian figure. Now, what people conclude from that is obviously up to them, but to then dismiss this, and there's a resurgence recently trying to attack that, this was a purely legendary figure. There was no historic basis whatsoever. And I think today we can pretty easily dismiss that. But I also want to recognize we have, Peter's words and obviously his direct relationship with Christ. We have Paul, which most New Testament scholars give at least 7 or 8 of those Pauline epistles authority as firsthand account of what he wrote. And James, the brother of Jesus. This is not a trivial thing if you think about convincing a sibling that you're the son of God. That's an impressive feat if you ask me. So I want to look just quickly at a couple biblical concepts, and then we'll dive into some of the other historians and authors that quote were in and around Jesus. Luke was a historian. We saw him talk about and name 32 different countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands with no error. I think it's pretty clear that he was a studied guy who, by all reasonable accounts, went to these physical locations. We know from biblical accounts he traveled with Paul at least on some of his journeys, but for a figure in first century, I think we see this idea that, historians look back and say, here is someone who's written a very accurate history of Hellenistic periods in Judaism. And you get these details of exact titles, army units, major trade routes, collaboration of dates with known governors and kings. Ian Bylock said, Luke is a consummate historian. Sir William Ramsay said Luke is a historian of the first rank. So these are... Oh.
Sorry, does anyone have a white Mazda minivan?
That's mine.
Can I get you to move it quickly?
Oh.
Sorry to interrupt. We have some basketball guys here. Thanks, Steve.
And so if the secular world is identifying him as a historian, we have to at least give some credence to the gospel account of Luke and Acts to at least be a reasonably accurate account of what transpired. And I think this is something that some of the New Testament scholars have really kind of bucked against. They really don't like ascribing Luke to him because it would directly mean that his gospel also would be a historic account. Acts, they tend to be a little more willing to accept because it's more of the historic spread of the church. But it's very interesting watching this almost dichotomy exist in scholarship where we want to deny the gospel account, but we're willing to accept some of the historical. Paul obviously was opposed originally to the Christian faith. He persecuted the church. Here was a guy who was, a very well-educated man. The way he wrote attests to that. He upheld this role as a great thinker, kind of within the Sanhedrin influence even. And by his account, he encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus somewhere around 33, 34 AD, a couple years, 1 to 3, depending on when you put Christ's death dating. But I also think it's really important where there have been some at least suggested attacks that have said, well, but how does he know what transpired? He wasn't firsthand. And if we look at Galatians 1:18, we see he spent 15 days talking with Peter and James in Jerusalem, somewhere around 36, 37 AD. Within a couple years of Jesus' death, he would have also probably interacted with the church at the time. I think his 1 Corinthians 15 cite says he did talk to eyewitnesses amongst the 500 that Jesus appeared to at one time. And then we see again in Galatians 2, 1 through 9, this second visit to Jerusalem with Peter, James, and John, somewhere probably around 44 to 47. It's a little hard to place it exactly based on his missionary journeys, but certainly within 10 to 15 years of his death. So these are three very influential figures that all had very firsthand knowledge. So the assertion that Paul didn't reasonably know what was being taught about the gospel, about Jesus' life, is absurd to me. Just these two situations, let alone some of the other biblical accounts. And then obviously the first full formal Jerusalem council dealing with Gentiles and those issues, circumcision, etc. And that would have included many of the early disciples, many of the early church leaders. We know he and Peter did get into a little bit and disagreed. So it's not like he just wholeheartedly accepted everything that even Peter himself was saying. They were contending for truth and getting down to it. And so if Paul's going to have any credibility at all, I think we have to recognize that this is a very educated guy who's very interested in understanding the truth, and had an opportunity to interact for prolonged periods of time, multiple times, with those that were firsthand witnesses and disciples. So now transitioning to non-biblical sources, and these are in your notes. You don't have to take frantic notes, but Tacitus was a Roman senator, an orator. Some argue he was one of the best Roman historians, so in his book Annals, he actually has this section out there about Christians being persecuted by Nero. He talks about Christ, or Christos in Latin, being executed in the reign of Tiberius under Pontius Pilate, that it suppressed for a time, but then it came back. So I think this is a pretty clear evidence that, even in the influence of the Roman Senate, there was an understanding of the influence Christ had had in that first century. These ideas that somehow that Christ or Jesus was a later invention doesn't hold up. Tacitus was writing most of this right around the turn of the first to second century. You also have Josephus, Flavius Josephus, if you didn't know his full name. He is very commonly cited. I think what's interesting for him is he was born right about the time of Christ's death and resurrection, and then died about 100 AD. He was a Jewish priest who grew up as an aristocrat within Palestine, ended up living in Rome, getting Roman citizenship. He then went back and was actually commander in Galilee under one of the Jewish revolts in 66 to 70 AD. 70 obviously is when the temple was destroyed. So he played both sides of this fence, but clearly was sold out for the Jewish establishment of the time. This is not somebody who would have been pro-Christian by any stretch of the imagination. And he twice mentions Jesus in his massive 20-volume history called Jewish Antiquities. So a prolific writer, that was written around 93 AD. And so he talks about this in the context of the Sanhedrin bringing the brother of the so-called Messiah, James, in, and ultimately being stoned, James's death. So it helps us confirm a fairly early death of James, so somewhere around 62 or 63 AD. Most likely, James obviously would have written the book before that by some period of time, but it still puts it pretty early in the first century, and you've got a oppositional force referencing the historic Christ and acknowledging he was the so-called Messiah. So he didn't deny the fact that even at that time, people viewed Jesus as the Messiah. This wasn't some later invention. He goes on in book 18, and this, some textual critics say may have been edited. I put in bold the ones that the modern critics question, because they don't think they would have given him this level of statement around Christ. It's a fair question. However, as a historian, what do you write? And so it says, around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought call him a man, for he was one who did surprising deeds, and a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He went over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by the men of the highest standing among us, had him condemned to be crucified, those who in the first place came to love him did not give up their affection for him, For on the third day he appeared to them and restored to life. The prophets of God had prophesied this and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians so called after him have still to this day not died out. There's a lot in there. Even if we grant some editing perhaps later in history, we do have fairly early manuscript copies of this, so it would have to happen pretty quickly. Because he was recognized as such a historian, obviously there were copies that existed of this, so all copies would have had to have been edited for these inserts. There's not necessarily a great explanation for why he would have called him Messiah in this passage, where it was so called before. It is what the manuscript says that we have, but I think at minimum, even the non-question sections still identify the crucifixion of Christ. Obviously, you have to physically exist to be crucified. And that his disciples continued on. I think just between those two sources, we can glean a couple of key things. One, he did exist as a man. His personal name was Jesus. He was called Christos in Greek, which means in Hebrew, Messiah or the Anointed One. He had a brother named James. He won over both Jews and Greeks. The Jewish leaders of the day expressed unfavorable opinions about him, and that Pilate rendered the decision that he should be executed. He was specifically mentioned as crucifixion in the account, and he was executed during Pilate's governorship in Judea. That Pilate was governor between 26 and 36 AD. So those we can gather pretty cleanly from the historic accounts. I think it pretty concretely demonstrates a historic Christ. There's a few other non-biblical sources. Some of the Greek writers were very opposed to this idea of Christ being the Son of God. They took great umbrage with it. In the beginning of the 2nd century, Lucian wrote this idea that he was a prophet, that he interpreted some of the Old Testament books, that he was a man that was crucified. He even says that the people that followed him had convinced themselves they were going to be immortal and live forever. They were willing to give themselves up, i.e. for martyrdom. So some of the martyrdom of the disciples would have already happened by that date when he was writing. That they all viewed each other as brothers of one another, which was a very unique concept, and this was one of the things that irked the Greeks. Much as it irked the Jews, you didn't cross-pollinate between Jews and Greeks at that time. That was not how the thing went. And so that would have been very offensive to both camps, this idea that a Greek and a Jew could be deemed brothers of each other. And that he highlights even they worship this crucified sophist or person, which even the Greeks found that to be indignant or insulting. And I think this is one of those things, if you're writing an account, you don't pick crucifixion in the 1st century as the means of death. It was considered to be shamey, it was considered to be indignant, it would have been an insult both to Jews and Greeks at the time. And quite frankly, it's why the Romans did it, was to impose this penalty that wasn't just painful, but was embarrassing, that was humiliating, that was intended to destroy the person's reputation. Interestingly, as we look at two places, religions that obviously oppose Christianity and would deny its truth, the Jewish writers of the time, the rabbinical writers, and this appears both in the Babylonian text as well as the Talmud, they mention Jesus or Yeshua and his disciples 7 times. They ascribe his miracles to sorcery, so they're acknowledging miracles happen, they're just denying the source. And then Moses ben Menon, sometimes known as Menides, brilliant Jewish thinker, he said concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who imagined himself to become the Messiah and was put to death by the court. So we have these oppositional forces that aren't saying he didn't exist, he didn't die, he wasn't really there. None of those are the accusations. And in fact, if we look at the Quran, I think it's fair to say Islam is not a supporter of Christianity. Funny enough, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is actually the only woman mentioned in the Quran, and she's actually mentioned 70 times, which I find very interesting. When you look at what it says about Jesus himself, and in Islam, he's known as Isa, son of Maryam. He's described as the Messiah. He was born of a virgin. He performed miracles accompanied by his disciples. He rejected the Jewish establishment. It actually places Jesus amongst the greatest of prophets in the Muslim tradition, and even acknowledges that Jesus will come in a second coming to destroy the false Messiah. But when you grant all those statements, they go, he absolutely positively was not the Son of God. Okay. Didn't see that conclusion coming from the facts you grant me, but sure. But I think this idea that somehow either the godhood of Jesus was invented later or the historic figure didn't exist is ludicrous given this evidence. I think it was really, really, really well understood in the first and second centuries that Jesus, at minimum, claimed to be the Messiah, the Son of God. That he was absolutely crucified. Most obviously leave silent the resurrection and the opposing forces, but most objective historians, recognized believers, thought he had been resurrected. So this isn't some fanciful recreation. This is what was communicated, believed, and recorded as history in the first and second centuries. There's a few other references that are lesser. Celsius, who also was a Greek philosopher under the line kind of the Plato thought, he considered Jesus to be a magician who made exorbitant claims. Pliny the Younger, Roman governor and friend of Tacitus, said that the Christian community at the time worshiped Christ as to a god and discussed how they should punish them to try and quelch the revolution, so to speak. Suetonius, who was a Roman writer and historian, wrote of the riots in 49 AD among the Jews, and he ascribed that they might have been about Christos, Christ, Jesus, and that he thought that the instigation of this might have been Jesus. So they're ascribing him with enough influence to have potentially caused a riot after his death, whatever, almost 20 years later. Interesting. And then one of the Jewish prisoners held by the Romans during this revolt, he described him as the wise Jewish king. So those are probably more sources than most of you are aware of or had been aware of from a historical view. I think it's pretty well documented by anyone writing at the time. They comment about Jesus' influence. Now, 2,000 years later, I think some historians at least would have to credit that Jesus might have been the most influential figure of the first century, period, certainly of Palestine. So why? I think this is what skeptics have to wrestle with, is what ascribes that success of someone who opposed, quite frankly, all of the power structure at the time, the Jewish and Roman leadership. Everybody wrote about him, so clearly this was becoming pervasive very early on. When we start looking at kind of the archaeology, it's interesting. I've heard some skeptics talk about, I want to see like a coroner's report of Jesus' death. And you're thinking, in the first century, those didn't really exist, but pretty sure the Romans knew what dead was. But let's see what else we find. And interestingly, one of the most commonly accepted stories about Christ was his baptism. And part of this has come because this Almageddus, because it's in modern day Jordan, right across the river, Jordan River, this idea, it means baptism immersion. It's been deemed even by the World Heritage Society a historic site. It's on the East Bank. It's very often referenced in Judaism as either Bethabara or Bethany. And very interesting, on the right you can see this mosaic. This is one of the oldest Palestinian maps. It's from a 5th century monastery, and where the red arrow points actually list the name Bethbara. So, even at the very earliest points in recorded maps, this place of baptism was recorded. And I think this is why historians have kind of been forced to, and they've done the archaeological dig and find these pools that are ascribed to be the place where John was baptizing. And it's consistent with the biblical account. It could have been a different site, certainly. We don't know with 100% certainty, but it certainly appears that this is a historic place that was well known, that it was recorded early in Christian history as the spot where Jesus was baptized. And again, points obviously then to a consistency of this idea of, John the Baptist going and baptizing people. That aligns with some of the gospel accounts of Jesus' baptism. The other one that was very interesting up until about 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of debate about Caiaphas because he's specifically named as the high priest There was some question of which of his sons took the role at what time, but there was a lot of question around, was this really the high priest at the time of Jesus? There was a huge question of whether the historicity of him was valid for that time period. And they've subsequently found both this house right by the Temple Mount that has dungeons underneath it where they could have kept prisoners, that have a courtyard that has several of the attributes listed, as well as this burial ossuary that has the name Caiaphas inscribed on it. And that was found in the 1990s. And so this starts looking like pretty clear evidence that, the pieces all start to align. The house is about where it should have been. There was a burial box, so to speak, with Caiaphas' name on it. Now this debate has finally, I think, kind of been put to an end. Historians don't tend to pick at this anymore as one of the evidences somehow that the gospel account doesn't align historically. And I think this has been consistent. We're continuing to find more and more archaeological digs and more research that validates the story of the Bible has archaeological roots in Israel. I certainly would not want to forget about prophecy. Depending on who's counting, there are hundreds or maybe even 1,000 prophecies of the Messiah. I picked just a handful. There are certainly way more than this, but I think these are certainly some good starting positions if you were ever trying to understand it. And so I give you the Old Testament reference and then the New Testament gospel account that says it was true. Isaiah, and again, pretty critical of the Isaiah prophecies because they did find the full scroll of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls back in the mid-60s. And so that was dated to somewhere around 100, 200 years before Christ. Because it is a scroll, we obviously know it was unedited. Start to finish, we have it all in one piece. And so being born of a virgin, and what's funny is the Quran also asserts that he was born of a virgin. And so we have non-biblical accounts, at least, that seem to indicate that that was the either objective fact or at least the reported facts. That the Messiah would offer physical healing again in Isaiah several places, and we see in Matthew, Luke, and John those fulfillments. That he would be betrayed. Obviously, we know Judas betrayed him in the gospel accounts. That he would ride on a donkey from Zechariah. We see it fulfilled in all four gospels. The idea of the triumphal entrance. This idea of the Messiah would end up in Egypt. Hosea talked about this, which Matthew documents. That Christ would be born in Bethlehem. Micah predicted that. Matthew shows it fulfilled. The piercing of Christ's hands and feet in Psalms 22, fulfilled obviously in John. And so we can see these statements from hundreds or almost 1,000 years earlier, in the case of Hosea, fulfilled in Christ. And it's not to say that no one of these couldn't be fulfilled by a historic person, but when you look at them in culmination, I think most credible critics say the odds of a person fulfilling all of them is really, really narrow. At the same token, I give the Jewish leadership at the time great grace because I think they were looking at some of these dual fulfillments where we also see a triumphant king, which we would describe as the second coming of Christ, as we see in Revelations. And being under Roman oppression, the Jewish people at the time would have been looking for someone who physically was going to remove the burden of Rome. We know after Christ's death and resurrection that there was another revolt against Rome that resulted basically in the destruction of Jerusalem at the end of the day. Masada and some other things in between, but this culmination of the revolt was stamped down by the Roman Empire and Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. And so when we look from this historic view and we see these things that were prophesied hundreds of years prior fulfilled in a historic person, my logical conclusion is, okay, this starts to fit this evidence around Christ is exactly who he said he was. When we start thinking about this even in maybe a little more modern context, if somebody had been sitting, somewhere in the square when JFK was shot and assassinated, and we have it obviously on camera, but we also have first-hand eyewitness accounts that saw him shot and killed. If you then 3 days later had an uprising there in Dallas going, oh, we saw JFK risen, it would create quite the stir. In fact, it would be a pretty hard sell in most cases. Well, that's exactly what we see in Acts 2, where thousands of people come to faith in Jerusalem, not because a couple of guys had some compelling message, but because some large segment of the population knew Jesus had come back and appeared to many people, that this was a common account. And I think Christianity has been perpetuated because of the experience that Christians have after conversion, encountering God in new and unique and distinct ways. But I can point to history and said, look, these writings were in such proximity, even this idea of, well, legend kind of transpired over time. No, if somebody's writing in 70, 80, 90 AD, and they're ascribing that at least Christ claimed to be the Messiah, that's what he claimed. And we see it even in the very earliest kind of basic creeds that appear in Romans and other parts of Scripture. It's a three-part, when we think about the gospel as most essential elements, pretty much the disciples consistently say it. Christ was the Son of God, he was crucified, and he was raised from the dead. Those are the three elements in what we might call the most essential of the gospel. We might argue that it's still fundamentally the gospel we teach today. There's some other things we might add to it, but that'd certainly be the crux of it. So likely, within the first 10 years of Christ's death, the prevailing understanding of the Jewish community in Jerusalem, and even some parts of the rest of the world as Paul's missionary journeys went, that was the essence of the gospel. We see it in secular historians' account, in essence, that he claimed to be the Messiah, that he was crucified. Some leave out the resurrection, but some attest that his believers felt he had come back to life. So those three things are affirmed, at least as the belief and the teaching and the understanding at the time. This wasn't a 3rd or 4th or 5th century creation. This was in very close proximity to the time of Christ. I also think it's important we talk about some very early martyrs. One of the things that's very interesting in scholarship is there's some questions around were all the 11 apostles that were supposed to have been martyred actually martyred. John obviously was in exile. But I would take it even earlier than that. I want to see the very earliest. And obviously, from the biblical account, we have Stephen, the stoning of Stephen. That would have been within a couple of years, probably one of Jesus' death, depending on whether it was 30 or 33 AD. James, the son of Zebedee, or the brother of John, was killed by Herod. We know James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned, and we saw that in one of the Roman historic accounts from Josephus. Peter, the Emperor Nero, had Peter crucified probably in 64 AD. Paul was also killed by Nero. That date is a little bit more of a wiggle room because Nero, if you didn't remember, went nuts and was persecuting Christians for several years. So there's a little bit of question whether it was 64 or 68 because Paul was a Roman citizen. There may have been some delays. But again, these were all within, literally 1 to 30 years of the death of Christ. These are people who believed this so deeply that they would not offer incense to Roman gods to get out of execution. That's a pretty strongly held belief. I think it's fair to characterize that they actually believed it. I saw a great quote this week by Chuck Colson, who was part of the conspiracy for Watergate. And his assertion is, I find it hard to believe that 12 guys would die for a lie when the 12 of us that were involved in Watergate didn't make it 30 minutes. And, maybe you say their beliefs weren't as strongly held, whatever, but they cracked. And a lot of them spent serious time in jail over it. His point is valid, that if you have multiple people involved in some cover-up or conspiracy or crime, somebody's flipping, if not multiple people. That's not what we see from the early historic account. That's not what we see from the third-party accounts. No attestation is these guys recanted, they changed their mind, they fessed up the truth. None of that is recorded in history for us. And I guarantee with 100% certainty if the Jewish leadership had even one, they would have been banging that drum real loud. Yeah, they admitted, they took the body, they lied, they did whatever theory we want to put other than the resurrection. It's also true that clearly, in very early terms, the gospel was held to be so sacred by these martyrs that they would give a public profession of faith, and some of these we even have them recorded, around what they believed while they were dying, in some cases pretty brutal, painful deaths. So I think we're left really with three possibilities when we look at this historic set of facts. First, that Jesus and his disciples were liars and committed the greatest cover-up in history. They somehow fooled everybody. They knew it was not the truth. They died for the lie. Nobody discovered the truth. Nobody ever found the body. You know, they hid it really well, whatever. That's an interesting one. And then I think motivation has to be a question here. Why would you do that? To never attain any earthly power or wealth, basically be a fugitive your entire life. The second is they were lunatics or delusional. You know, that they believed it, but they were just insane. And then we'd have to ask this question. Obviously, we're all 500 people that Jesus appeared to insane. Was Paul insane? Certainly the writings we have of these disciples seem to be pretty darn coherent and logical and rational. If you've ever dealt with someone that isn't fully in their mental faculties, sadly, it usually is pretty apparent in their speech patterns and the ways they communicate, the things they talk about. It's usually pretty obvious. That was not also, by the way, a first century accusation. This is actually a relatively recent theorem to explain it. The final, I think, conclusion would be that the disciples saw and interacted with a resurrected Jesus who was in fact God. That the account they gave was in fact the account that occurred. And that all of the non-Christian historians and Jewish and ultimately Islamic writers said that Jesus didn't fit in this nice little square of just some fantasy made-up legend or extraordinary, change of the facts. That the historic facts that are reported align perfectly with the Gospels. Sure, they don't cite the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, there are pieces of the Gospel that are left out. But in that crux of that Jesus was an actual human being who was crucified and whom lots of people believe was resurrected, that then turned into a movement that spread throughout all of the known Roman world, to which some of these, like Tacitus, were trying to figure out how you stamp it out. Nero burning Christians, executing and feeding to wild animals to try and rid the population of Rome, at least, of Christians. This was a pretty committed group of people that defied at least what we'd consider to be reasonable self-protection. And so we're going to take a little detour, then we'll come back and answer questions based on timing. Dave has volunteered to play the skeptic for us and recount his, 20-odd years of conversations with people that legitimately struggled to believe that any of this is true. And so we'll play this out a little bit. We'll see how it goes. He hasn't told me what the questions are, so it'll be new to both you and I at the same time. So we'll have Dave come up and we'll grab seats.
Check, check. I volunteered for nothing. You asked me to do it so they could have tape at the church of me denying my faith. And finally
It's a grand setup.
take me down. So what are you doing back there, tough guy? You're falling apart. Are you nervous? Uh-oh. His cord came out, John. It like broke off. So yeah, show him. So we could share this until he gets it figured out. I think it's not going back together. Wow. What a tactic to get out of this. Yeah, to try to get out of my questions. That's just sad. Well, yeah. Yeah, that's coming out of your paycheck, Ryan. see anything.
All right, there we go.
Back to normal.
Yep.
Okay.
As normal as.
So let's just, do you need to introduce this at all? Let's just pretend, I'm going to go full character,
You go.
fourth wall. So let's say all this nonsense you've been brainwashing us with these 4 weeks is true. So there was a Jesus, and he said all these things, and he is God, all the stuff you've been telling us. So I would be, as a skeptic, as a non-believer, if I understand the message you've been sharing, I would be damned in my sins and going to hell for eternity because I'm not on the right team or I haven't done whatever things a person's supposed to do to deal with that. So my first question is, why then have no Christians ever told me this? If I believed that, I would tell everybody I ever knew about that. So that just seems like, that seems really unloving and really shocking to me. Do you guys actually believe that?
So let me tackle that in two parts. First, let me ask you a question. Have you ever had an experience that didn't seem to line up with the physical universe, something that you might describe as spiritual?
No, not really.
Nothing?
I mean, I like the end of Hey Jude by the
Yeah.
Beatles a lot.
Yeah.
Makes me feel good.
Yeah.
But I don't
Had a little out-of-body experience on Hey Jude?
yeah, yeah. I don't think so. I don't think I've ever had any weird, like, kind of experience. But
Never had an accident that could have gone differently? Never had a
yeah.
event that seemed not aligned to the reasonable statistical odds?
Gosh, maybe. I'll give you a maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is a legitimate question about, should God separate himself from those that don't know him or don't accept him? Let's try and put it in a modern context. If we had a judge here in Spokane who every murderer and every rapist and every violent criminal that appeared in front of him, he just said, nope, go on your own way, no consequence, no punishment. What would you say about that judge?
I would say that sounds like many judges in Seattle, but not necessarily Spokane.
Yeah. Would you think that was justice?
No, of course not. No.
So to get a little personal, no matter how small an item, how young you were, have you ever stolen anything in your life?
I think I have, yeah.
Have you ever told a lie at all?
Several.
So what do we call somebody that steals things?
A politician.
Sometimes.
A thief.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What about people who don't tell the truth?
A liar.
So I think all of us have things that we've not upheld to our own moral code. If you grant that there is a creator of the universe at all who is perfect or good or holy, would it be reasonable then that that perfect being couldn't coexist naturally with someone who had violated even their own principles?
Well, I get where you're going with this, but isn't God all loving and all accepting? Or
Do you think that in earthly terms, somebody who's your friend can be loving but not always support the things that you do? So would it be reasonable that maybe God, as a perfect being, his very nature, can't coexist with evil?
I feel like you're trying to tell me that's what.
Well, you tell me.
The
Is
case
that
is.
logical or is it illogical?
Well, my question was if it's true. So it's kind of two questions. Maybe you're answering the second one. If it's true, why hasn't anyone ever? Why aren't Christians more engaged with this message and telling us? Are we just supposed to go to hell and figure it out on our own? And then secondly, I asked you, I guess, if you believe this message. So I think it's more of a
So to your first point,
yeah.
yes, the church has not always done what it should, and Christians haven't always been a good example, quite frankly. Even if they were telling you, they may not have mirrored their own beliefs. I have not always mirrored my own beliefs. I've made mistakes. I've acted in an unloving fashion at times. There have been people I have not forgiven.
Yeah.
I don't think that changes the nature of God. It says that I'm flawed, not God. Secondly, Scripture talks about people are judged according to what they know. And I think in the United States of America, we have the privilege that virtually even every hotel we go into has a Gideon's Bible in them.
Yeah.
It is hard to exist in our culture with no understanding, at least of the basics of what Christians believe. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, whether it's political, philosophical, scientific, to pursue and find truth. That I think when we have questions, the reasonable response is to pursue those questions. And there has to be some level of personal responsibility as well of what do you want to do with Jesus? I've given a case for why I think it's true. You're free to reject that. That's totally fine. I just think it's a really important question to get right.
So why is it more right than all the other religions? Is the person in India who was brought up with a different God or a different way to heaven, are they going to burn in hell forever as well?
So it might surprise you to find out that today, amongst Hindus and Muslims that come to faith, somewhere between 25 and 30% of them report a vision of Jesus or a man of light coming to them in a dream, giving them specific instructions of how to pursue him. There are times where God does reveal himself distinctly. We see it in the New Testament with Paul. I think for Americans, we have the means, the opportunity, the methods to explore it. Christ himself says, I am the way, the truth, and the light. No man comes to the Father but by me. That's an exclusive claim. Jesus was either crazy when he made that, or it's valid.
So some of these people have dreams and visions or whatever, but a lot of people don't.
A lot don't.
So God is choosing to reveal himself to some and not to others?
I think the way God reveals himself does vary. I also would say that to your first question, how come the church isn't doing a better job? That's a fair critique. I think there should be more examples.
I guess I just think they don't believe it. I don't know that they're doing a better or worse job, but how could you believe something like that and not tell people about it? That seems rude.
It is. and it's maybe the least loving thing a Christian can do. But that's part of why we're having this conversation, is I want you to at least be able to have a real conversation, ask questions, and then you decide what truth is.
I see. I just don't know, too, when you're talking about all the prophecies, they often seem very obscure originally.
Yes.
Like Psalm 22, he'll be pierced for our transgressions, or that's Isaiah 53.
Yes.
Psalm 22 has a lot of similar imagery, and then it seems like it's applied to the experience that Jesus went through. How would you explain why it's not more clear that his name will be Yeshua and he'll be 5'6" and he'll, be a carpenter's son, or things that would be more obvious? They seem real mystical. And
Some are certainly more nebulous, but I think where he would be born, that he would be born of a virgin, his heritage, his lineage from the tribe of David. There were some that were more specific. And I think you have to look at it in its context holistically. Out of hundreds of prophecies, are there even a few that are really clear and reasonably fulfilled in Jesus?
are there?
I believe there are.
Yeah. Which ones?
I believe being born in Bethlehem is pretty specific.
Yeah.
I believe being born of a virgin is really specific and really unique. And in fact,
That's not verifiable, though, really, in any way other than the ways that you...
well,
the
one of the
accounts.
major religions that's opposed to Christianity, Islam, writes it in their Quran that he was born of a virgin.
Wow.
So that's at least a third-party attestation. They may be mistaken.
Interesting.
And I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be a step of faith. I think there's a reason a loving God also doesn't just put on neon bulletin boards in the skies saying, Jesus, my son, come find me.
Yeah.
It would take away free will. And I think Jesus wants us to come into voluntary relationship with him to discover what he has.
So Jesus sounds great.
Yeah.
And I like him, but the Old Testament God seems almost like an entirely different person when I read the Old Testament.
Yep.
He seems capricious sometimes, angry, almost the opposite of the tenets of Christianity. How do you explain that? It seems like someone just came along later and tried to make them fit together, and then it didn't really work. The Jewish people didn't buy it.
Sure.
And they kept doing what they were doing. But why are they so different?
Well, I think one was a covenant based upon works and temporary righteousness or atonement. Jesus represents a ultimate grace or ultimate atonement. So I think the nature of the relationship changes. But furthermore, let's look at, because there's some valid critiques of what about when he tells them to destroy an entire tribe of people? It might surprise you to find out, but those tribes that were generally called to be annihilated did things like child sacrifice, putting the children on burning hot metal idols till they died. I think most of us would say that's not good, and that there has to be a place where evil is not tolerated. And I think sometimes we have misconstrued that in the current context as arbitrary and capricious instead of based upon the historic facts at the time.
So would you say every time that God in the Old Testament did something that people like me think is bad or mean or evil even, every single time he was justified in his actions?
Yes, and let me give you maybe a broader context. I believe the Bible is a meta-narrative of creation, a fall of man where man became corrupted and evil and sinful, to a restoration, and ultimately a restoration even of that state of Eden or perfection in the final analysis. And it's all God guiding his influence throughout history to bring us to the time and the space of today in 2023, where we now can come into the presence of God because Jesus has paid the price for all of our sins that we've ever committed or ever will commit.
So in this class, were you trying to convince us that God exists, the Christian God, or were you trying in any way to convince us that God is, I have a question, that God is good, or just that, so far, just that God is?
I would
'Cause
primarily
I have a lot of
tackle-
questions about whether God is really good or not.
Yeah, I was mainly tackling the question whether God exists. But I think, is God good is a fair question. And there is suffering, there is evil in the world, and a lot of people will look and say, how does God allow that?
That's what I was going to ask.
And it's a very fair question. I think most of us looking back at history could pick out an event like Hitler's Nazi Germany and say that was an evil that shouldn't have been allowed to continue.
Yeah.
And it was stopped. In the Old Testament, there were some similar things. Sodom and Gomorrah, ones that are cited very often as an example of God directly intervening and putting an end to evil. And then there's everything in between. And I think we never will know completely the mind of God, but we can know his character. And my personal experience is that I learn the most personally when I encounter hardship or suffering. When things are going well, I don't tend to learn as much. C.S. Lewis, who you may know from the Chronicles of Narnia movies, also wrote a book around Christianity.
Really?
And he said that pain is God's megaphone. It's how he communicates with us in the most clear fashion.
Wow, that seems really messed up.
Think of your own life. The
also
things
messed up.
that you treasure most, was there a cost to those? Did you have to pay a price to get them?
That's too personal.
All right, in your family's lives, looking at the people around you, do you think that they generally have grown the most when things are going well or when things are hard?
Well, that's a neat talking point, but I think I and others are more troubled by a child that's sexually abused, or it's
Yes.
not a trial or a
Sure.
storm that they've gone through that will build their faith, but something genuinely traumatic and destructive. Where is God when those things are happening, and do I want to believe in a God that allows those kind of things to happen?
And there's no doubt there are evil and tragic things that happen every day. You can't watch the news without concluding that. I think that mankind is given a pretty broad range of free will. I believe that man is inherently wicked and corrupt, and I think I don't have to go too far to prove that.
Right.
And that God wants to redeem people from this corrupt or wicked state into something better. I think people on their own tend to continue down a path that's probably not great.
This all seems very complicated to me.
So when you get to the crux of what Jesus said, he said he loved you particularly so much that he was willing to die on a cross, to suffer greatly, to be unfairly killed for your behalf, so that you could be redeemed and transformed into something much better, much more significant, both in this life and the next one. Do you think that Jesus was deluded when he said that?
When he said,
That he loved you
well,
that much, that he wanted you to be made whole, to be transformed into something spectacular?
Ryan, you speak as one having authority, not like the scribes and Pharisees. Where may I find this fountain of eternal life? You're doing great. You're doing good. So what was your question to me?
Do you think Jesus was crazy when he said that?
Well, I don't know. I don't think so. It's just become so convoluted and so complicated since Jesus. I like Jesus a lot, but, and I don't know if you're comfortable with this line of questioning, but just some Christians are just terrible.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of pastors who get rich off of being a Christian. Jesus slept on the road and was homeless and had 2 tunics apparently. And so I like him. I'm very troubled by all of the religious stuff around it and everything. Do you know, what should I do with that?
Great question. If you look at Jesus himself said, I didn't come for the whole, I came for the sick. If you look at his disciples and who came and hung around him, it was the outcasts, it was the prostitutes, it was the broken who came to him. And in fact, the religious elite at the time, he had some very negative words for. You whitewashed sepulchres filled with dead men's bones, you brood of vipers. Those were the pastors of the time. Jesus judges the heart, not the title or the stature. There are always going to be people who misuse any position of influence for personal gain.
Yeah.
I, as I said earlier, have made my mistakes. I am not a great example every day. I don't believe I was made perfect. I just believe I was started on a journey to improve a little bit each day, and when I fall, I get back up and I try it differently. Every person has to stand and give an account in the throne of heaven for how they lived their lives, how they managed their affairs, how they handled people that were hurting and lost.
to your questions, both around how come people don't say the gospel, how come they're not sharing, and how come pastors or others seem to get rich, twisting the gospel maybe for their own purpose. All of those people have to give an account.
I'm glad to hear that.
I think the difference is those that at least have accepted Christ as Lord and Savior are covered by grace, where those that say I'm rejecting Jesus are not covered by that grace. And they're going to be judged based on their own human works.
So what will happen to me if I decide that I don't agree with you? I don't want to.
Do you think there's any more important question to get to the bottom of than what will happen in eternity?
I don't know. I like watching TV and just having fun. Hanging out with all my bros from WSU and shotgunning beer cans. I'm in character. I just feel like we're just here, I just feel like we're just here for a while and then we die and then there's nothing else.
So you don't have any sense inside of you that anything is non-biological or eternal or transcendent of any fashion?
Not really, no. I mean, it seems like religion is becoming less and less important to people and less a part of our culture, and one day it'll just be gone, I think. But I just wonder, tell me to my face, if I don't believe this, what's going to happen to me?
We talked earlier about the idea of what's justice. I think the character of God will demand justice. I think God also, in this idea of free will, extends that into eternity. If you say, I don't want to be affiliated with you, I don't want to submit to you as God, the logical thing is then for you to be eternally separated from him, both based upon your human acts and mistakes, as well as your conscious choice to say, I don't want to be part of it.
And what did I ever do to him? And you're not saying hell, you're saying separated.
Yeah.
But what did I do to deserve this kind of treatment from God?
We talked earlier that there were things that you violated even in your own moral code. And I would suggest that maybe there's an absolute morality that exists independent of whether we recognize it or not. And at the extreme, God, how I would describe him, is perfect or holy. And that can't coexist with something that's corrupted or broken or flawed. We've popularized it maybe in the form of Raiders of the Lost Ark, but there is a biblical set of accounts, and the idea that where God is, flawed humans can't be and live. So there is a separation that comes whether you acknowledge that moral code or not. We've all broken it. We've all put ourselves in a position where we can't coexist in perfection or holiness. And I believe the only of the major world religions that gives any absolute certainty of salvation is Christianity. The rest are all earning your way basically into heaven. Your good and bad somehow put on a ledger and the scales of justice are weighed. Christianity says no matter how much bad you've done, there is a sufficient covering of redemption that is so great, it covers it all. And I think my view is, yes, there's lots of entertainment. There's hundreds of channels of TV. There's YouTube. There's lots of distractions. But few people who I know find that to be the richest part of their life. Most people find it in relationship, of engaging with other people, of doing things that matter. They have a sense in them. They want something to be there after they die. I think Christianity perfectly mirrors to that and says, in fact, there's even a bigger purpose. It's to be in relationship with God for all of eternity.
But all you've told me, if I don't believe, is that I'll be separated from God?
So the separation that the Bible describes is heaven on one hand in relationship with him, hell on the other. There have been lots of near-death experiences, in fact, a couple million recorded just in the last 100 years. Some of those near-death experiences are things like traditional fire and brimstone. Some are interesting, which is basically groups of people sitting naked on rolling hills that are completely hopeless and isolated. I believe that hell is closer to the biblical, but even if you take in some other possible suggestions and it just being a place where there is no hope, that's not a place I'd want to be. So when you think about where you'd rather be, would you rather be in heaven where it is good and life is fulfilling, or a place just of darkness and hopelessness, let alone possibly fire?
I don't know. I just feel like Christians don't even agree on a lot of the things that you're talking about.
I think there is a uniform belief that apart from Jesus and his redemption, we have, in essence, sentenced ourselves to separation from God. And that Jesus is the way in which we are redeemed, transformed, and made whole, both in this life and the next.
So that story when Jesus is dying and he tells the guy next to him that you'll be in paradise with me, that guy never did anything good.
Nope.
He didn't, there's no record of him submitting to the Lord. So people like that get to go to heaven.
He acknowledged Christ as the Son of God, I think, in that moment. We believe as Christians in grace. As I said earlier, all the other major world religions are on works. That guy on the cross couldn't have gone to paradise or heaven or any of the other terms that are used because he wouldn't have had time to earn his way. Where Christianity says there is grace in the moment. It doesn't finish our journey if we still are living, but it starts us on a path that is redemptive.
Do you want any more?
Sure. We got a couple minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The earpiece is going.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So let's see, what else? What about the gays? Why is that so bad?
Christianity talks about that sex outside of marriage is not the design that God had. That between one man and one woman, he intended this to be a beautiful thing and actually to be a reflection of the relationship between Christ and the church. We know that people have sex outside of marriage all the time. We also know statistically that that group of people, if they do marry, tend to get divorced at higher levels. We know those that don't ultimately get married tend to have pretty high percentages of regret. Psychologically, sociologically, reproduction and the basis of what we generally see to be the foundation of society is driven around the core family. So I think it's what the Bible teaches is consistent with what we can observe. At the end of the day, God says all sin is equal. We all have our own things, and I'm not going to judge one sin is different than the other. I'm just going to say it is in opposition to God's best plan. And every time we do that, there's a cost.
Do you feel like we talk more about that one, though, than divorce or other things that the church used to not like very much?
No doubt. I think in humanness, there are things that get prioritized or identified. It's always easier to talk about something that we don't tend to do.
Yeah.
If you look at very practically, the sins that we tend to see being more prevalent for men, it tends to be sexual sin. Women, interesting enough, the Bible talks about gossip. Yeah.
We're not the nicest debate partner.
And so it's easy to overlook what we might categorize as, quote, trivial sin.
even in the Gospels, we see this account of a Pharisee giving this very public and overt prayer. Thank God I'm not a sinner like that guy. And it's condemned. I think part of humility is understanding our limitations and understanding our weaknesses and working in conjunction with God to overcome them and to work towards what's best for ourselves. And I'm sure you've had things in your own life where you once believed something to be true or good that you've now concluded maybe it's different. That's part of the nature of maturing. And I think in a spiritual world, there are lots of opportunities to mature. Does everybody do it? No. There are a lot of people who can go to a church, do the rituals of religion, and not be changed. What the Bible says is that you will know true believers by the fruit they bear. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. That those things should be growing and evident.
So why is there so many crazy stories in the Bible? Like a man is swallowed by a big fish, and I haven't seen anything like that happen. Like why is it, the river turns red and it parts and all these different things, these fantastical stories. You don't really believe those are true, do you?
I do. And to me, it's a fairly simple issue. If I have an all-powerful creator of the universe, define our reasonable laws are easy for him. But I think we call them miracles for a reason. They are the exception. They are extraordinary, if you will. But it's also God's overt symbols to people groups, or in some cases individuals. They're either on the right path or they're on the wrong path. Making a donkey talk, making an axe head float. I mean,
wait, there's a talking donkey
there
too?
is.
Oh, jeez.
And it's not just Shrek.
This is even, I like him. This is even weirder than I thought, man.
But it's God's desire to get our attention. And in my own
Why doesn't
life,
he do that anymore, though?
in my life,
Other
he
than
has.
Shrek, I mean.
And here would be my challenge for you. If you really want to find out the truth for yourself, make a commitment for the next 2 weeks to wake up every morning and say, God, will you please reveal yourself to me? And honestly live out the experiences of each day and see what you find to be true.
I could do that.
And in 2 weeks, we can get together and you can tell me whether God showed you anything that wasn't just sheerly mathematical.
To do this again? Will you at least buy me coffee? or
Absolutely.
something? Okay.
Double espresso for you.
Did Jesus know that Judas was a weasel?
Well,
That
he
seems
did
really weird.
call it out on the Passover feast that he said, one of you will betray me.
Yeah, but I was like, it's probably obvious at that point. I guess I was more curious for those couple years. Did he?
I don't know.
Yeah. You weren't
I,
there.
I believe that clearly Jesus knew a lot of the details that were coming. We see it in the Garden of Gethsemane before, where he's sweating like blood, wrestling with what's coming. He foretold the destruction of Jerusalem. I mean, there were clearly times and places where he had knowledge that could not have been known by a mere human. Whether Judas specifically he knew from the beginning, I don't know. I think God did know each of us before the formation of time and all the choices we would make, and chose to allow us to exist in spite of our mistakes and flaws, because he wants everyone to be in relationship with him, but he also is very clear there will be many that don't choose him. There will be those that say, I don't want this.
Well, I'm close to believing what you're saying. But it's just such a weird story.
Yeah.
I mean, some nobody in the middle of Nowhereville died for the sins of all mankind, and we've got a couple references from a history book a million years
Yep.
ago. I'm supposed to just devote my life to this?
So why do you think this legitimate person that was a nobody from nowhere
Yeah.
had such influence even to today?
I just right place, right time. I mean,
So backwoods Rome was the logical
it was
place?
center of the universe for that moment in time. I don't know, but it seems to be losing steam, over the At least here, at least in our country. it
Absolutely
seems.
here. In fact, the places that Christianity is growing the fastest in the world are where it's most rejected or oppressed, or in many cases illegal. That it's actually banned to practice. And those punishments go from jail to death.
Yeah.
I would suggest that the reason Christianity has survived is there's an authenticity to it. That doesn't mean that everybody that you'll encounter that claims the title Christian, A, is either A, Christian, or B, is living well, but that when it is loved well, it is good psychology to love more people, to forgive more people, to engage in a world around you, to be the one who has compassion and sacrificing for the betterment of others. I think our culture needs more of that objectively. And to your point, as Christianity has diminished in the United States of America, I think we could argue our social problems have increased, not decreased. And
But
you know,
aren't Christians just hateful and
some are. The reality is there is still humanness of us versus them. I'm in a club and you're not. That's a human trait. That's not what God asked for. That's not his ideal. God, in fact, Jesus says when he's asked, okay, all this history, all this time, to your point, all these stories, what's really important? He said it boils down to two things. Love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbors yourself. If you get those two things right, all this complexity gets real simple. Now, do we pull it off well all the time? Of course not. But in those days where we're striving towards it, and to those Christians who legitimately attempt to live it honestly, they tend to be the ones who are donating their time, they're donating their money, they're in their communities with their sleeves rolled up, they're feeding the homeless, they're doing after-school tutoring, they're funding hospitals in third world countries, they're building wells where there is none. Those are the things that are happening right now today in the name of Christianity. Yes, there are bad things that happen, absolutely, and throughout history there have been, in the name of Christ or the church. But that's not what Jesus called for.
So it seems like when Jesus came, he was supposed to be the Jewish Messiah, and they all just rejected it. And now there's Jews, there's Jewish faith and the Christian faith, and they're very different. And it just seems like, oops, it didn't work, and now we have Christianity. How did the people that should have known the best and the clearest couldn't see it, other than Josephus a couple hundred years later, or a couple decades later, writing, that he existed? Like, how do you explain that?
So at the time of the promise of God to the nation of Israel with Abraham, he also promised that from that line would come the Messiah for all people, not just Jews. But the Jews would have a special place and would be his witness to the nations. That's true. Also remember, for the first several decades, most of the church was Jews. Jesus was Jew. His disciples were all Jewish. Some did see the truth. Joseph of Arimathea, who gave the tomb to Christ, was part of the Jewish establishment or leadership. So, yes, many didn't see it. Absolutely true. I also think that that was partially contextual. What they were thinking the Messiah was going to be at the time was a king, not a sacrifice. We know, at least by the New Testament, the idea is that king is going to come in the future and he will establish his kingdom. But for now, we have choices to make whether we pursue Christ or not. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 or 3 billion people on planet Earth do identify as Christian. I certainly won't say all of them are following what Christ asked, but some are. And many of the orphanages, hospitals, feeding programs, clean water programs around the world are staffed and funded by Christian groups, because they believe very seriously what Jesus asked of them, to be part of a solution, not part of the problem.
So if I take this 2 weeks and ask God to reveal himself to me, and he does, then what do I do?
Then it's really simple. then it's okay, God, I want to know you better. I'm going to accept Christ as the Bible represents him to being Lord and Savior.
And do I have to join a church? Do I have to?
We have a secret society you join. No.
No. No, that's what I don't want.
I think part of the learning process is we can continue this conversation, but yes, the logical place is to be part of a church where there's a diverse group of people that'll have a bunch of different voices, that some of them will resonate for you. Some won't, that's okay, but you probably will find a few people like you who have had similar journeys, who maybe even will help you understand things quicker, that can model what it looks like to genuinely try and follow Christ. Flawed as we are, we're stumbling forward, we're determined to move on towards this place that God is calling us to be. And in that journey, my personal experience is, it is the great satisfaction of my life, not to work for my own self or my own interests, but for helping others, to seeing others thrive and grow. Those are the things I find most rewarding.
All right, I'll see you in 2 weeks then.
All right?
And see.
Yep. So that's what a conversation might look like. I think those were certainly very typical types of conversational questions. Other than where you had said you had had no sense of a spiritual, because I think I've had that once in 40 years.
I really grew up with no, so I was trying to remember what I used
Yeah.
to be like. I really didn't have any
Nothing.
curiosity about it. Yeah.
No, not curiosity, but no experience.
No. Just watched Gilligan's Island after school, and
I did too. Batman, you can hardly wait
that
for the
was
next
my life.
episode. Questions? Yeah.
I wanted to talk to the skeptical Dave about the angry God of the Old Testament.
yes,
All right.
ma'am.
Those people turned their back on him numerous times. And they had idols. And God sent prophets and said, repent, repent, turn back to the Lord. 1,000,000 times. And they never paid attention to him. And so finally the prophets would say, we deserve punishment for this, but please remember your mercy. And they expected a king. The Jews expected a king to come with all the, the big horse and this and that and the other thing. And he came on a little donkey. And that's why they're still waiting for the big horse and all that. But I think that God has covered their eyes, the Jews, and he will reveal that to them in the future.
I think one of the things that frustrates me, though, because your answer was good, but at a honest reading of the Old Testament, I think that you have to know a lot of extra information to know that what you said is true. It appears, that a lot of innocent people are getting hurt. And are we online?
Yeah.
So, okay, I guess I'll use the mic then. When I evangelize, the number one thing that happens is people, basically just say, well, the Old Testament, God's mean, and and they'll list different things, and it's nothing but a cause of barrier in sharing the gospel. It's interesting, but you're correct. But it's not. I don't think it's obvious when you're reading it that, oh, these people were warned, or there was an ice, or and then even with that, a lot of innocent people do get people get hurt. So it's really I find that very challenging. If you really want to talk to people about the Lord, they immediately bring those things up.
In BSF this year, though, we spent 9 months studying, the Old Testament and all that. So, yeah, I have a fresher view of that. Yeah.
And most people don't want to do the work to
No.
to
It
really.
was rough. It was rough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I meant a skeptic, doesn't want to
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
really know. They just, yeah. So what would be like, I didn't ask you any hard questions.
Like?
No, I guess I just mean what I was trying to do was typical.
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know.
I think that is typical. But what would be an example of the hard question?
Oh, I just mean like the logic. I was going to ask you a question, actually. It was just more like, what would be one of the hardest questions somebody's ever asked you? Or
I mean, I think problem of suffering is always a hard one.
Yeah.
The reality is there are
I didn't
innocents.
put the screws to you and act
Yeah,
belligerently.
sure.
Like, that's kind of what happens
Yeah.
sometimes when you're talking about these things.
And I think in those more belligerent ones, I tend to go more towards questions and start to probe in. Well, tell me more about that, or flesh that out for me, or what's your explanation? To try and help them articulate differently and figure out at some point, and usually in starting these, I will put forth the idea, I can give you a reasonable belief for God. I can't give you 100% proof. I can at least show that the arguments for God are at least balanced against God. Is that sufficient for us to have an intelligent conversation? Because some will outright say, no, even if you could, very clearly articulate God, I don't care. Okay, next. But if there's a genuine interest and a desire to learn, great, let's have the discussion. I think in a place where innocents are harmed, yeah. And then I think the question we talked about a couple weeks ago is very true. Was this the best universe God could create for the most people to come to faith, given free will, given sin? Joan.
Well, I think you might ask Dave, give me an example of something really bad that happened in your life. Can you think of
Yeah.
anything good that came out of that
Yeah.
as a result?
Yeah, and I don't mean to be so combative, but when it's something like my priest touched me,
Yeah.
somebody's not going to have a,
Yeah.
Right.
well,
No.
but if it's something like, my dad left when I was 8 and my mom and I are real close, that's a little easier to answer, I guess, but.
And you were very kind to, I wanted to tell him he was going to go to hell if he didn't. But you didn't do that to him. That was good.
I tend to find in these conversations debating the nature of hell doesn't get constructive. I think it's this idea of with God or away from God.
But see, I thought you were kind of a weenie in that
Fair.
moment, because I feel like that's the message, and I understand you might meet with the guy a second time and
Sure.
blah, blah, blah. So you're, really good at that. But I just think it's like somebody's got to tell
Yeah.
people the truth.
Yeah.
And
Maybe after
Yeah.
2 weeks he'll
that's
Yeah.
what I mean. Like, I understand that.
Yeah. Well, and everybody's going to have their own flavor and way of doing it. I think each of us have our own stories, our own experiences, and that's part of what I paint in the idea of church. If you come and meet this diverse group of people, some of those voices will speak to you. Because not everybody is going to be best friends with everybody else, and that's okay. God created us with different gifts and backgrounds. But I also have seen where God has used the horrific for his glory. Yes, it is the minority, but I have seen those cases too,
Yeah.
where you hear somebody's story and go, how are you even upright, let alone, functioning, instead of a huddled mass in the corner given your experience. Any other questions as you guys saw this, or you thought of other questions that skeptics have asked you?
No, but I thought it was good, like, especially when he said, well, so, what is, get down to the point, if I decide not
Yep.
to go, what's gonna happen
Yep.
to me? Is it just the, oh, yeah, yeah. I thought that was good, yeah.
Well, and I don't mean to be negative, but I've had very few on your side constructive conversations. And like if I was being real, I would have just brought emotion into it and called you a racist.
Sure.
And there's just a lot of things. If you're having a lot of times these high level does God exist questions are a lot of straw man arguments and a lot of emotional baggage and stuff. So I think a more real one would be like, well, you're a mean person telling me that,
Yeah.
and who do you think you are?
Bigoted, racist, blah, 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 sure. And I think it's incumbent on us as Christians not to get sucked into that emotion.
Yep.
To acknowledge, and hopefully you saw me say that a couple times, that's a good question, that's a great question, or even prompting, around the suffering, to acknowledge, sure, there are things you're going to have to wrestle with to help encourage, hopefully, or validate the legitimate. So when you get that emotional, you get the extreme that's just totally off the charts, you can draw it back to, okay, but here and now, let's talk about that. And again, I've seen a variety of apologists, whether they want to even get into that there are churches and Christians that don't do it well. I tend to go, that's the truth, so I'm okay with that. It's just not what God intends.
And I thought that was a good question, like, too, of, why does God let, like, innocent children, the bad things happen, or miscarriages, or babies
Sure.
die that just barely get started. And it took me a while to realize that it's like, we all are sinful and fall to sin, but yeah, I just thought that was a good one.
And we're in a world that is corrupted, and we see that as part of the curse in Eden, that there will be thorns, there will be difficulties, you will have the sweat of your brow, you will have pain and labor. I mean, there were things that changed about the physical world.
And I just want to say I came to this class because Ryan has been a really good friend to me this year and has been a very loving and supportive friend. And I think this is a good class, and I hope you can do it again at a time when more people can come.
Yeah.
And I hope that you could knock it down by about 15 minutes
Yeah.
each hour. And I hope you guys would maybe bring somebody the next time he does it and give a larger audience an
We
opportunity.
used to have a larger audience, we
Yeah.
used to have like almost
Yeah.
25.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and this is different. Maybe this is a good thing, but thank you very much is what I was
Absolutely.
trying to say. Thank you very much,
Absolutely.
and I think you should do it again
Yeah.
in a different setting. And that
Well,
these
we
guys
talked about
should.
trying to do an evening one or an alpha style course.
And just because it is on tape, I love the Lord Jesus Christ. And that was very awkward for me because I actually grew up so unreligious that when I met Jesus, I've had zero doubts. Like, I've never had the classic doubts that like people maybe who grow up in church feel like, are they brainwashing me or did they? So it's kind of a weird role for me to play. So.
You knew before and after.
Yeah.
And many of us have those experiences. All right, well, in the live stream, if there's any other questions you guys have that you want to come talk about afterwards, we can do that.